Hello and good afternoon. My name is Kit Cabello of Harlan's Media, and this is a very special exclusive interview that we are doing. We're talking to Steve Schwartzberg. He's one of the many candidates who's running for Congress in the 5th Illinois Congressional District. Steve Schwartzberg, thank you so much for joining Harlan's Media. We're very happy to have you here with us.
You're very welcome. It's good to be here.
So, essentially, you're running for the nomination for the 5th Illinois Congressional District. You're running against 3 other candidates who are running in that district as well to earn the Democratic nomination. And so, essentially, can you tell our viewers and subscribers about yourself and why you're running for this congressional district?
Okay, so I'm running for this congressional district because I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter. I'm running for this congressional district because I'm a lifelong social democrat who believes it's time for a moral as well as a political revolution in this country. My training is as an historian, Yale PhD 1996, a scholar of the history of American foreign relations who believes it's possible to draw from our common past to build a shared future. My favorite revolutionary among the founders of our country and the framers of our Constitution is the Pennsylvania lawyer James Wilson. Years before Thomas Jefferson, Wilson had written that all men are by nature equal and free. We, the American people, according to Wilson, are sovereigns without subjects. This was and is, in my opinion, a succinct way of stating the most basic ideal of the American Revolution. It took the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement to even begin to make this true for African Americans. It took the suffragists and the women's rights movement to even begin to make this true for women. It took the labor movement and the trade union, organization of trade unions to even begin to keep this true for working people, to prevent the power of the state from being used on behalf of corporations to make subjects of workers. In our own day, it will take a moral and political revolution to keep the 1% from making subjects of the rest of us and destroying the promise of the American Revolution. And it will take repentance on the part of the American people to cease attempting to rule over the native peoples as if they were in any way our subjects or subject to our jurisdiction. Those are the basic motives behind my candidacy.
Now, there's a lot of people who are critical of the Democratic Party and neoliberalism as a whole. And you have received support from the Illinois Berniecrats and Social Democrats. So what is the significance of getting grassroots support, especially for this midterm race of 2018? And as a candidate who is not with the establishment, why is it important to reform the DNC? Can it be reformed at all?
So fundamentally, I think there are more important issues than just reforming the Democratic Party. There's the need to reform the country, to rebuild the moral consensus on which our nation's progress rests. To see that happen, we have to have candidates in every congressional district stand up and support a social democratic program of action and reform for the country. That's the path forward, to articulate Medicare for all, to articulate a massive program of infrastructure in the nation's roads, bridges, waterways, electrical grid. All of this needs investment. To articulate the need for a freedom budget for the 21st century to abolish poverty, to articulate respect for the tribal sovereignty of the native peoples, to articulate the need for a foreign policy that respects the rights and interests of others and is concerned with the global common good. If we can get candidates in each congressional district running in this basis, on the basis of the people's agenda that our revolution has articulated, for example, we can persuade the American people, the solid majority of the American people that I believe supports these kinds of programs and policies, to get active, to get involved, to join the political revolution to transform the country.
Across the board, this is a question we've asked many candidates as well. Independents, Democrats, Republican voters want to get money out of politics. For your campaign specifically, what have you seen so far with money in politics? And if you're elected, how will you address in the Congress the growing influence of money in politics and the power of the lobbyist groups that have a huge amount of influence?
So just as a small contribution that I make to this, we don't accept corporate PAC money, obviously, in the campaign. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, this is a problem with regard to Citizens United. The Supreme Court has opened the door to this flood of black money into the political process, and that door needs to be closed. That can be closed either by the Supreme Court recognizing that it was mistaken or by constitutional amendment. To some extent, we can amplify the contributions of small donors through public financing and begin to move away from some of the influence of this corrupt money in our politics. But more fundamentally, I think it requires people in the country realizing that the Supreme Court's decision rests on a mistaken understanding of the influence of corrupt money in our politics. So let me give an example of this. In 1998, Citigroup merged with Travelers Insurance, in spite of the fact that the law on the books was the Glass-Steagall Act, which prevented such mergers. At the time, the head of Travelers Insurance, Sandy Weill, said this would not be a problem on the basis of the conversations they'd had with the Fed and the Treasury. The head of the Treasury at that time was Robert Rubin. Rubin lobbied the Congress to gut Glass-Steagall, and the day after it did so by a bipartisan vote of 343 to 86, Rubin left the Treasury. 3 months later, he was hired by Citigroup for a salary of $15 million a year without operating responsibility. That is the kind of corruption in our politics that has to get changed. And in order to get it changed, people have to be aware of it. People have to know this is the history, this is the background to the rise of the too big to fail. It increased their strength and their importance in the economy enormously. It's part of the background to the crash in 2007, 2008. And it's got to get changed. We've got to bust up the too big to fail. We have to return to a country and a policy that puts the common good ahead of the 1%.
Now, in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election, many voters have been critical of the Democratic Party, and there are a few organizations that are trying to reform it. Our Revolution, for example, is one such group. Yet there is still resistance from the establishment Democrats, and they're still trying to avoid embracing the political policies of Senator Bernie Sanders. It has also been revealed that the DNC is still struggling with fundraising. It is not taking advantage of its recent wins last year, and many DNC leaders in Congress still remain close to Wall Street, banks, and corporations, not really coming up with an alternative other than resist Trump. And while that is important, there's no alternatives that many voters are seeing that being provided by the Democratic Party. If elected, what will be your stance in regards to getting a message out to potential voters of what relief can be given to working class families struggling in America? And will you also challenge DNC establishment leaders that are tone deaf to what progressive and independent voters want?
Absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, what we have to do in this country with the Democratic Party is to make it into a social democratic party. And the way to do that is to campaign on the kinds of programs and policies that will help working people and help working families. I've advocated a massive program of infrastructure investment for the country. I've advocated Medicare for all. I've advocated a freedom budget to begin to eliminate poverty with investment in public education and housing, in job creation and job training. These are the kinds of things that every Democrat in the country, or at least every progressive Democrat in the country who's running for office, needs to be articulating and needs to be persuading the Democratic Party first and then the country as a whole that we as a country should be adopting.
Now, on your campaign page, there are 3 issues you discuss, and it is stated, among our purposes as a people in sustaining our nation, our Constitution speaks of providing for common defense, promoting the general welfare, and securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Rather than campaign on bullet points, although I do offer a few, the 3 links below are extended essays on each of these topics. So first, for our viewers and subscribers, I would like you to at least discuss promoting the general welfare, and what does it mean?
Okay, so I think we have to go back to first principles. I think part of our weakness, we as a progressive movement, we as the left, we as the Democratic Party, is a failure to articulate first principles that goes back to our defeat in 1980 and Ronald Reagan's victory. Ronald Reagan ran for office and in his inaugural address claimed that government is not the solution, government is the problem. And we didn't have an effective response to that. And the effective response to that is to go back to Abraham Lincoln and say the legitimate purpose of government is to do for a community whatever it needs to have done but cannot do itself or cannot do as well in its private and individual capacity. We need to respond to each of the conservative dogmatic points, the talking points that they've been offering for more than a generation, instead of buying into them. I think neoliberalism bought into Reaganism to a considerable extent. Yes, it was a little bit more humane, it was a little bit more civil, but it didn't challenge the fundamental presuppositions on which Reaganism carried the countries in the 1980 election. So we didn't push back. So when we got into political power again, we didn't fundamentally change the course of the country and move it in a healthy direction. So as a result of this, the privileged treatment that the rich have enjoyed for more than a generation, in the form of preferential tax cuts, preferential bailouts, preferential access to credit, has led to a situation in which the take-home income of the 1% has gone from about 10% of the total in 1980 to more than 21% of the total in 2015, more than doubled. This is the exact wrong course that the country has been on for a generation. Wages for most working people have stagnated over this period. This is what needs to be fundamentally changed.
Now, in providing for the common defense, the open paragraph states, we are now in a global social environment in which hopes for a world of democracies at peace with each other have faded dramatically. This is in no small measure a difficult consequence of American efforts to promote democracy in Iraq by force and violence, an abysmal failure that not only cost the Iraqi people and ourselves tremendous losses in lives and treasure, but which also contributed to the growth of extremist movements in the Middle East, particularly ISIS, and which helped unleash a wave of nationalisms around the planet as confidence in an American-led globalization has faltered. As the Great Recession and increasing awareness of the growing gulf between the 1% and everyone else further discredit the process of globalization, the process of the world becoming a single place, the whole role of the United States in the world came into question. People even began to ask if the American dream still had meaning. What does providing for defense mean, and how can it be passed in a Congress in which money and lobbyists have a huge amount of influence?
So the first thing that providing for the common defense means is working within the context of this world becoming a single place to benefit the world as a whole as well as ourselves, to think about the rights and interests of all of the peoples of the world and not only the rights and interests of the American people. I come at this as a scholar of the history of American foreign relations whose expertise is in U.S. Latin American relations, and I look at the broad sweep of the 20th century in terms of U.S. Latin American relations. The first third of that century involved interventions in Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua that were very similar to our intervention in Iraq. The rhetoric that was used to support these interventions was the rhetoric of promoting democracy. The reality of our conduct in these countries was contributing to dictatorial rule and to human rights abuses and violations. In the course of the 1930s and 1940s, the country moved to a more respectful posture under the good neighbor policy, and then moved to a posture of actual solidarity with democratic forces in the early Truman years. That was followed by a wave of dictatorial coups and democratic breakdowns that looked a lot like the Arab Spring in the early part of the 2010s, and then subsequently the loss of hope in the Middle East with the winter that has taken place since then. There was a second wave of democratic openings in the late 50s and early 1960s, and then a subsequent wave of military coups and democratic breakdowns, and then a third wave of democratic openings in the 1970s and 1980s, which has carried Latin America into a much better place than it was for much of the 20th century. Something similar, I predict, will happen in the world as a whole, will happen in the Middle East, has already happened to some extent in Africa, will happen in Asia. In Europe, there will be a revival of democratic movements. I believe ultimately that there will be solidarities among social democratic forces in every country in the world, helping to make a more peaceful and prosperous and ecologically sound and just global community. And that's what the foundation of American security in the world is such a community. And we can contribute to that by respecting the national sovereignty and national autonomy of other peoples, and by standing in solidarity with progressive and democratic movements in other countries.
Now, for the final point, as securing the blessings of liberty, I found it very interesting in how, in your last paragraph, you were talking about how we have to build hopes and not only just persuading other groups to join, but to think critically and embrace new policies and new ideas, but to also have open communication. So what will it take to have securing the blessings of liberty, since there's so much divide and lack of trust in our current system? Congress right now, according to a recent poll, stands at an approval rating at 8%, which is even lower than it was many years ago when it stood at 11%. How can the securing of blessings actually take place here if there's been so much divide?
So there's been a lot of talking at each other in American politics for more than a generation. There's been very little talking to and with each other. Fundamentally, we have to learn to listen to each other, and we have to think about what the broad consensus is in the country of where we've been as a people and where we're going. This is what we need to do as a society, as a civilization. This is a difficult task. It begins, I think, with respect for the rights and interests of others, with listening with civility and compassion to other points of view. But ultimately, it will take a series of electoral victories and a sequence of national elections to build a new consensus in the country. It took a long time to build the consensus of the New Deal in the 1930s and 1940s, which lasted for a generation. It took a long time for the Republicans to build the consensus behind Reaganism, which lasted for about a generation. It will take a long time to build a consensus behind social democratic programs of reform and advance for the country as a whole, but that's the course that I think we need to be on. We need to go back to first principles and explain why we as a people are better served by a government that seeks to do good for the common good than by a government that seeks to serve the 1% in hopes that the 1% will do good for the rest of the people. It is time to water the tree of economic growth at its roots instead of its top leaves.
Of course, as you are campaigning, you have to reach out to potential voters or people who are maybe haven't put much thought into the 2018 midterm, and when you have your volunteers canvass or when you hold community events, what has been the voter outreach? What has been the community's outreach towards you in regards to the Democratic Party, most notably where they even voted to increase surveillance powers to the Trump administration, even though many of those said Democrats, Nancy Pelosi to name, basically said we must resist Trump, he's going to be a threat to our democracy, when in turn they decided to increase more surveillance power and give his administration more power. What has been the community's outreach towards you in regards to really trusting the Democratic Party, where they say one thing and then do another thing altogether.
So I've run for office as a Bernie Sanders supporter. I tell people straight up front, I got involved in politics again after many years canvassing for Bernie in Iowa and Wisconsin, and it's his program and policy that I'm advocating, and people trust Bernie. They know that he stood for these things for 30 years. They know where his principles are. They know where his programs are. That's the set of principles and programs that I'm seeking to champion in the 5th District. Fundamentally, the Democratic Party made a phenomenal mistake in 2016 in choosing Hillary Clinton to be their nominee. And Hillary Clinton made a fundamental mistake in choosing to run against Trump and on behalf of the status quo. We cannot afford to make that mistake again. If we try that in 2020, we will lose in 2020. Trump has the advantages of incumbency now, which are powerful advantages. The only way to win and win this country back from the 1% is to articulate a program of social democratic reform for the country and to champion that program in election after election.
All right, and I want to return back to the Citizens United ruling. With the way our current system is set in place, the person with the most money for a campaign usually wins, thus their ads are seen more on the radio, television, even on the internet. And it's really difficult for a grassroots candidate to get their message out. It's clear that the impact of Citizens United as a ruling and other rulings similar to it has affected both parties. As a candidate that's challenging the current incumbent, what do you want to say to critics who say that grassroots candidates cannot win or cannot make an impact?
So the fundamental point I would make here is that anytime you lose, you've got two choices. You can blame someone else or you can blame yourself. And you can try and learn from your mistakes. We on the left have not been blaming ourselves. We've been blaming other people. We need to look at what it is that we can do in terms of grassroots organizing, in terms of social media, in terms of getting out the vote, to elect candidates who are pledged to progressive programs and principles. If we fight for progressive programs and principles, we will make the difference in this country. Our history shows that. The whole history of the United States is the history of it becoming more true to the principles of self-government, more true to James Wilson's formulation that we are sovereigns without subjects, and that all people are created equal. If we fight for those principles, the principles that were fought for generation after generation to try and make those ideals more true, we will win.
Returning to another concept that's rarely talked about, but is probably gaining more traction, it's the idea of states' rights. Recently, Jeff Sessions said that federal law will supersede states that have medical or legalized cannabis in their states. And that leads to the question of if the government's going to intervene in just cannabis laws, what else will they supersede in regards to state rights? And so what impact could this potential 2018 midterm Congress do to basically stop Trump, if in regards to, or even anyone in the administration like Jeff Sessions, to basically stop them from interfering in the rights of individual states? What can Congress do?
Okay, so the most important thing that Congress can do, in my opinion, is articulate a program of social democratic reform. So we need to put details into our support for Medicare for all. And Bernie Sanders is starting to do this. The upcoming town hall meeting will give us a chance to put substance into the program of what massive infrastructure will look like in the country and a program to decarbonize the country's economy, to put substance into a freedom budget for the 21st century that will abolish poverty. We need to articulate these programs in town hall meetings across the country and to show people when it comes to, say, legalization of marijuana, that this is an issue that we stand for, that we have a set of proposed legislation, and to solicit input and critical feedback from the communities that we're trying to serve, we as elected officials. And with that feedback, build a consensus in the country on behalf of the programs that we're seeking to advance.
All right, and final question for our viewers and subscribers. Where can they learn more about your campaign? March 20th will be the primary voting day here in Illinois, so all the nominees who are running for office will then eventually head into the general election. So where can we find you on social media? So
SchwartzbergForCongress.com is the first place to find me on social media, but also Steve Schwartzberg for Congress on Facebook.
All right, Steve Schwartzberg, thank you so much for joining Hard Lens Media. And to all our viewers and subscribers, you can listen to us every Saturday on Q4 Radio from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and on Instagram. And we also have a mini-series on CAN TV, Channel 21. Your help allows us to do more content. Please support us, check us out, and let's all do what we can to build a better future.
You're watching Hard Lens Media.